Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me for another session of AF Digital's Masterclass series, this time featuring Pardot. This is now session 3, and I'm Zeke, and I'll be taking you through today's topic, which is automating your marketing programs. The couple two sessions first, if you tune into both of those, it was conducted by Karen, Kate, and Kevin. Was all of names start with K, by the way. I just noticed that. They took you through the first session, which is getting started with Pardot, which is more of like an introductory session, and talked about what Pardot is, what it can do for you, and just some of the basic components and concepts that's needed in order to understand the next two sessions that will follow. And then session 2, conducted by Kate and Kev, was a deep dive into the Pardot components, specifically more for the Pardot assets or the content that you can produce with Pardot, which is the email templates, the landing forms, form handlers, and as well as the custom redirects. Basically, the things that you would need for your marketing materials when you're actually working with Pardot. So for today's session, this is more of to put it in the context of, let's say, having a car. The first two sessions talked about what the car is, what the specs of that car is all about, and how the basic key concepts when it comes to driving that car. So in this session, we'll be having more of popping the hood of that car, taking a closer look at the engine, and just making sure that car runs more smoothly and more efficiently. So we'll be talking about automating your marketing programs or your marketing automating process in Pardot. So we'll be talking about the different ways you can actually optimize tasks when it comes to Pardot. So we'll take a quicker look at the agenda after this slide, but engagement programs, which is supposed to be a part of this session, although I kind of decided that this is kind of a very big thing when it comes to Pardot. So we'll be having a separate session dedicated for engagement programs. And if you're interested in that, you can actually use this QR code to scan this QR code. I'm not sure how this works. I think Karen might be able to explain it to you later on. I don't know where you're supposed to scan this, but don't worry if you don't know where to do that now. I'll be flashing this slide later on again. So let's have a quick rundown of the agenda for here today. So I'll be talking first about integrating Salesforce and Pardot, primarily because there are a few automation actions that will be only made available when you actually sync Pardot and your Salesforce CRM. But aside from that, knowing why or how syncing Pardot and Salesforce can be beneficial to you is important nonetheless. So I'll be discussing that first. Then we'll be going through the star of the show, which is basically the segmentation and the automation. And these are the different things that you'll be seeing here later on: the segmentation rules, dynamic list, and so on. I'll be elaborating more on that as well. So let's talk about first integrating Salesforce and Pardot. So as with all Salesforce products, actually let's run over to the objectives here. After this section, it will be understanding the benefits of connecting Pardot with Salesforce, and then just some of the triggers for syncing and queuing for syncing of the records between Pardot and Salesforce. And I'll be showing you some general things that you should be aware of, certain considerations that needs to be taken into account when integrating Salesforce with Pardot. So as I was saying, when we're talking about why you should integrate Pardot with Salesforce, well, the very first thing you need to understand is with all Salesforce product, the beauty of Salesforce, that it has the ability to connect with each other, the connected clouds. And Pardot is no different than that. It can connect with Salesforce CRM very easily. And when you're thinking about why you should integrate it, just know that when you're doing this, you're actually getting the best of both worlds. CRM is already a very powerful sales tool that any sales team can actually handle. Gives them a 360 customer view, and it enriches their data in CRM by having all these different objects that can connect to this, just further know who this customer is. You're leveraging that CRM in coordination with Pardot, which is essentially a lead qualification and marketing tool. So Pardot will be the one responsible for sending out communications to your customers, and setting up this elaborate standardized process for knowing whether or not this is the customer we need, and just how much what the score of this customer could be. And then you'll be able to send leads once you set up these scoring model or your lead qualification process. You'll be able to actually send leads from Pardot, or your prospects from Pardot, to Salesforce when they're qualified, and from there the sales team user in CRM can actually, using the different tools within CRM, they can actually nurture and develop that customer further. But aside from that, since you're syncing your information bidirectionally, you're also sending data from CRM back to Pardot. And let's say you have certain CRM fields that you might be interested in having in Pardot in order for it to be used in personalized, say, emails or personalized messages. You can actually do that. You can sync your certain custom fields within CRM and have it in Pardot, so you'll be able to reference that field, communicate much more effectively using Pardot. So going through that, um, uh, with CRM as a sales, once you sync Pardot with Salesforce, here's just some of the things that you can see here. Once you've actually set up Pardot in Salesforce, you'll be seeing Pardot fields and Pardot data, as you can see here on the left side, the screenshot, and some related fields such as these important related list here is what we call the engagement history. Engagement history will be made available. Basically, this is the different activities that is being tracked in Pardot, and you'll be able to see this in CRM. So as a sales user, you'll be able to identify what way you can actually communicate with, or what are assets have this particular customer communicated with you so far, and you'll be able to come up with strategies on how to communicate with this customer further. On the other side, with Pardot, we're actually sending CRM data, and as I mentioned, you can actually sync uh, the different fields, lead and contact fields set up, so that this particular fields or CRM data will actually be updated as well when you actually update the Salesforce record. So we have this sets of fields from your CRM, and you can also have it in Pardot. And as well, you can also, once you've synced with Pardot and Salesforce, certain actions that is done by automations, as well as engagement programs, creating tasks, Salesforce tasks, adding them to CRM campaigns, that will also be made available once you do the sync with Pardot. And as I mentioned, you can set up automation rules, which we'll be talking about more later on, in order to send them as leads, or create them as leads or contacts within CRM. So so the question is no longer if it's beneficial or not. It's obviously beneficial. And at this point, if you have a Pardot account, and if you have also a Salesforce account, sorry for that, um, and if you still haven't connected them, then it's basically just you're just limiting yourself to this two products alone, and connecting these two platforms would open up a lot of avenues for new tricks in order to how to effectively use these two tools for your business. So if I manage to actually sync a Pardot and their Salesforce, what will be made available to me if I sync them? So this is just a high level view. So obviously record and object information, primarily, which is the lead and contact, will be made available in Pardot. And as I mentioned, you're also sending the Pardot data back to the lead and contact in CRM. Updates, whenever you're updating the prospect record or the lead and contact record, you can have them synced. So any changes would have the accurate data. And CRM related automation actions will also be made available. So you can integrate, Pardot's different actions such as tasks into your current CRM workflow, or how your business is actually, integrate how CRM actually works within your business process. And then we also have obviously certain Pardot actions will also be made available in CRM. So sending emails, say updating prospects within CRM, that's very much possible, since you can actually once you've synced, certain quick actions will be made available in CRM, so you don't have to log into Pardot just to send out an email to this particular customer. You can do that once you've synced them. So as I mentioned, you're actually syncing the lead and contact fields in order to have the most accurate data. So how do we know or what activities actually initiate a sync from Pardot to Salesforce? So from Pardot to Salesforce, these are just some of the activities that will initiate or queue this particular record to be synced. So say the sync actually happens every 2 minutes. Pardot actually checks for any changes every 2 minutes. And these are actually the different triggers that it can actually queue that particular record into syncing. So with prospect activities basically on the customer side, these are the things that they can do that will initiate the syncing to Salesforce. So if they submitted a form or answered a form with a form handler for Pardot, or basically interacted with any marketing cloud asset, primarily these three, form handlers, and landing pages, as well, but unsubscribing as well from the emails or opting out, that would actually initiate it to be synced, that record to be synced from or updated with a Salesforce CRM. On the other hand, we also have user activities that can actually initiate the queuing for the syncing. So if you import prospects or if you change a field in the prospect, that would also actually trigger them for the queue for syncing. If they're associated Pardot campaign changes, and if they're assigned user, so the assigned user has to be a user within that can be an assigned user for in CRM. If that changes, that will also trigger the sync as well. And obviously, there's a button on the prospect itself. If you actually go here and check out some of the prospects, there would be actually a button that would say, sync this contact or sync this contact or lead. Or here, as you can see, sync with CRM. And there's also system actions that can actually trigger the syncing from Pardot to Salesforce. So any changes that can happen because of any record changes can happen that was done by an automation rule or completion action will actually trigger the sync as well. Any add to Salesforce campaign actions that can be done by the different automation tools you're seeing here right now, as well as the different Salesforce campaign status updates will also be actually triggered the syncing. So now that we have a basic thing of a basic understanding of when does it sync or what does it sync, if you're actually trying to consider connecting these two things together, here are just some considerations you might take into account when you're setting up your Salesforce Pardot connector. So the main thing is actually one of the most important things is that you can only have one Salesforce connector in Pardot. So meaning if you have like 5 Pardot accounts, each of them can only have one Salesforce account, and they can all actually connect to the same Salesforce org, but one Pardot account can have no more than one Salesforce connector. So in Pardot, you can also integrate the Salesforce person account record type, so that is supported. And I think that's one of the concerns that actually that's being usually raised if this Salesforce person account is usually supported by this platform. So don't worry, that is supported with the Pardot. One thing you should consider is importing prospects into Pardot syncs them with Salesforce. As I mentioned, that triggers the queuing. But unassigned prospects or prospects with no assigned user to them will actually sync to Salesforce if they have a matching email address. So normally you have actually 2 ways to actually set up the syncing. You can actually allow Pardot to actually sync records that have with the same email address, or you can choose not to allow it. If you actually choose to allow it, Pardot will now actually use CRM ID as well, or the lead or the contact ID to check if that is the same record within Pardot. If you don't allow it, the default way that actually Pardot can identify that this user, the same user in CRM, is through the email address. So unassigned prospects or no prospects in Pardot that don't have any assigned user but has an email address will be synced to Salesforce based on the email address. But records that will not be created if there's no matching email address. So if it's a prospect that doesn't have an assigned user and it also doesn't have a matching email address, they won't create a new record in Salesforce CRM. And lastly, there's other things that you can consider, but these are just some of the most important things. Pardot checks for changes in Salesforce up to every 2 minutes, as I mentioned, but it depends also on the large volume of records at time. Uh, it can actually affect how these, sync happen. And uh, this will actually, one thing you can actually consider is when you're actually creating a new custom field and you're actually uh, trying to set that up in Pardot, that's going to actually trigger all of the current prospects to actually queue up for syncing. So that can affect other activities that trigger the syncing. So basically, as I mentioned, it queues up for which records is going to sync. So you just have to take into account if you're updating a large volume of records at a time, and basically if you're updating all the current prospects, it's going to take longer for all changes to sync. So uh, those are the things that you want to consider when you're actually connecting Salesforce and Pardot, and it's why you should actually connect Salesforce and Pardot. Basically, it gives you the best of both worlds, and it opens up a lot of doors for certain activities that you can do on both of these platforms. Now, let's move on to the actual, discussion for today, which is all about the segmentation and automation. So last week, the session was more of creating the marketing cloud assets. Now in this session, I'll be talking about how you can use them in conjunction with the automation tools that we have in Pardot in order for them to be optimized, and there would be no need for micromanaging these marketing cloud assets as well as the lists, the prospect list that you may have in Pardot. So after this, in this section, you'll be familiarizing yourselves with different ways you can actually automate your segmentation, as well as certain tasks in Pardot. You'll be able to know the appropriate automation tool you would need to use in the given situations. So automation is very important nowadays. It increases a user's productivity by not having to, manually do each of these steps or activities. Uh, in Pardot, there's several tools that can help you out. And here are just some of the tools that you can see here. So we have the segmentation rule and the dynamic list, which is basically the primary purpose of these two automation tools is for segmentation. So if you want to do segmentation, uh, these are the two things that you can actually take a look at. And then we also have page actions and completion actions, and these two are actually more anchored on the prospect actions or prospect interactions with your marketing cloud assets, or your landing forms, your form handlers, or your landing pages. Uh, and then we also have the automation rule, which is basically kind of uh, the most flexible tool that you can actually make use of. But each of these automation tools that you're seeing here right now actually have their own, pros and cons, some things to consider, and which is why at the end, near the end, I'll be discussing, when to use the appropriate automation tool. And then we also have engagement programs that will be discussed more in the session, hopefully next week. And engagement programs, if you're familiar with Marketing Cloud, it's similar to what we call the journeys there. So basically, it's like a customized, flow or drip campaign that you can actually create in Pardot in order for each customer to have, a customized experience on which email to receive or which activity will they be in. So that will be discussed more in the session after this one. So they will focus on these automation tools. So let's have a certain scenario first in order to understand the first automation tool we'll be doing. So let's say an executive at Big Shoe Incorporated wants to have a list of all the prospects in Pardot that are currently in the system that have a prospect score of 85 and above, and are either from PH or Australia, so Philippines or Australia. So he only needs this prospects that satisfy the score as of this moment. So this is actually a one-time requirement from this executive right here. So what will you use to actually generate this particular list? And this particular list is actually filtered out based on the prospect score and based on the country that prospect is in. So in order to do this, you actually use a segmentation rule. to create a one-time list of all PH and Australia prospects with a score greater than 79. So before going over and how to do that, a particular requirement, here's just some information about the segmentation rules. So segmentation rules actually creates a list of prospects and apply a segmentation action based on that specified criteria. So think of this, it kind of functions like a snapshot, basically based on the criteria that you actually define. It's going to take a look at all the current data that you have or all the current prospects that you have and takes them out. And because it's like a snapshot, by nature, it will only run once. So when the rule is actually run, you can't run that rule again. So the purpose of running this particular rule is to primarily just get that snapshot or get that subset of prospects or that list of prospects. And the primary use for this, obviously, is just for using or building lists. So going back to this scenario, let's take a look at how we can actually, or how I can actually manage in Pardot to create this one-time list um, for this particular executive. So if I go to prospects, there's going to be segmentation here, and there's going to be segmentation rules. So I've already made a segmentation rule that's capable of doing this. So as you can see, there's an 80 and above from PH or AU. And basically from here, you can actually identify what the actual, the criteria for this. So the prospect default field country must either be Australia or the Philippines, and the prospect score is actually, this should be actually 74, so 85 and greater. So prospect score is greater than 79, and from here you can see all the prospects as well that can actually be part of this particular list. And this segmentation is going to create a list. If you go to segmentation lists, you're going to see all the different lists here. Let's see all current lists. As you can see, there's a list here, and you can see all the prospects that are in here. And this list can now then be used as part of the recipient list, or let's say a suppression list that you might have when you're doing engagement programs or actually email sends or list emails. So uh, going back, segmentation rules, the only thing that you should actually remember, if your primary purpose is just to build lists and you only want this rule to run once, then what you might be opt to go for when automation tool that you might want to opt for using is the segmentation rule. Okay, so that's fairly simple. It's straightforward. It's a one-time use for creating lists. Then you use segmentation rules. So let's take a look at the next scenario. So maybe this time your sales team manager asks for a list of prospects that sales users in Pardot have tagged as VIP. So you can tag prospects in Pardot, and in this case, you tag them as VIP in order to keep track of them and send them specialized emails from time to time. So this list actually needs to be updated regularly. So obviously you'd want to actually have a list of, let's say, VIP in this case, in this context, that you actually want to have with you at all times, and it has to be updated regularly. So in this case, what you might do is, instead of opting for segmentation rule, if you want to have it update regularly, this time you'd opt for a dynamic list. So a dynamic list is different from a static list in the sense that based on the criteria that you define, it's going to be automatically adding and removing prospects from that list. So you create a dynamic list that gets all the prospect with a criteria for prospect that are tagged as VIP. So here are some of the things that you should remember when we're talking about dynamic lists. So dynamic list is rule based and automatically updates when a prospect's data changes. So the most obvious thing here is that it refreshes constantly based on the criteria that you define. It cannot be converted from a static list, meaning if you have created static list, you can't actually change that now into the dynamic list. And it can be used as well as a suppression list or recipient list for list sends and engagement programs. And one key feature here is that you cannot manually add or remove prospects in this list. That is because dynamic list is actually self-managing, meaning that, let's say, in this scenario, we're looking for prospects that are tagged as VIP. So we actually take a look at all at the dynamic list here that I've created. Go back to segmentation list here again and check out the dynamic list, which is the VIP prospects, what the sales team manager asked of me. And if we take a look at the criteria, prospects tag contains VIP. So what this means is that what I mean by constantly managing the prospects within this list is that if the tag somehow from this prospect or my prospect gets removed, this will actually get updated and remove me from this remove this prospect from the dynamic list. And this actually will actually make sense even more later on where we're talking about the automation rule and how it differs from the automation rule. Since basically you can actually add prospects to lists as well and remove them from lists. And the key thing that you have to remember is that when you're building lists and you want it to be updated regularly, if that's your main purpose, it's just to have an updated list, then you should use the dynamic list. Now, let's move on to other automation tools that we have. So this time, marketing has set up an event sign-up form on the website. So the event sign-up form can be an existing form that you have and you actually put in your form handler, or it can be a form that you actually created in Pardot and inserted into your website, or it can be a landing page that you've actually set up a form on. And they want an email to be automatically sent to these prospects, to anybody or any prospect that completes the form. And the assigned sales user also needs to be notified as well. So this time you're not actually trying to create a list. You want an email to be sent out immediately to the prospect whenever they complete that event sign up form. And the assigned sales user for that prospect must be notified as well. So the sales user will be notified if that prospect actually wants to attend that event. So the way you can actually set the automation tool that you can actually make use of to actually perform this requirement is to actually set up completion actions on whatever marketing cloud asset that you use. In this case, it's the form. So you set up completion actions on the form to send an autoresponder email and notify and the notify user action that you can actually have set up on the completion actions. So completion actions, let's talk more about it. So completion actions automate certain tasks triggered from prospect actions on a Pardot asset. So it only works on prospects, not on visitors. So just a quick backpedal here. As you know, with Pardot, you can actually see the visitor information as well. So if you don't actually have an existing prospect in Pardot, you're initially tagged as a visitor. So you have a visitor ID, and once you're converted to the prospect, that visitor record is actually just associated to your prospect record. But in this case, if you're actually looking for completion actions, they won't actually apply to visitors. That is because you don't have enough information to accommodate the actions or the results that completion actions can actually do. So it only works for prospects. So it also, one thing you should know is that it also works in any page that contains the Pardot tracking code. So the Pardot tracking code, as discussed in the earlier sessions, this is generated when you actually set up a Pardot campaign, and the Pardot a Pardot campaign, or you have a Pardot asset. So there's a Pardot tracking code there, and you can actually insert that in your existing marketing cloud or Pardot asset rather, or your website. And the one thing that you should actually take note of is that it's not retroactive, meaning that if, let's say, I set up a completion action on to understand this further, let's actually take this scenario as an example. So as the marketer required, there's an event sign up form. And in this case, we go to content and take a look at that form. As you can see here, let's say for this example, this is the form that they were using. And what they want is to actually send out an actually an autorespond email as well as notifying the users. So if you edit, if you're actually setting up the Pardot asset or you're actually editing it, there's an option here where you can actually set the completion actions. So in the completion actions, you can set it here, and this is what they required: send autoresponder email. Here are just some of the things that you can actually do with completion actions. Add tags to CRM campaign, add to list, adjust the score of that particular prospect that actually submitted that form, create Salesforce tasks as well, and obviously the two requirements, which is notify the assigned user for this prospect, as well as sending an autoresponder email. So I've set up an autoresponder email, and this is the email that gets sent out once that particular prospect submits the form, and you notify the particular user, which user is supposed to be notified if they actually submitted that form. So this is actually where you set it up. So going back to what I was saying when we're talking about being retroactive. So let's say when you first created this Pardot form, you didn't actually put any completion actions here. So, and let's say about 10 people have already completed the form, and then you actually went back and edited this form and you actually applied these completion actions. And once you hit save, the initial 10 that has already submitted the form will no longer will not receive the autoresponder emails, or will not, the actions that you define here, they won't apply to the first 10 that's already submitted or completed an action on this particular form. That is because completion actions are not retroactive. They only actually happen once you've actually set the completion action. And from there, once the completion action has been set up, only then can the actions be triggered based on what activity they do from the marketing cloud or the Pardot asset. I keep saying marketing cloud. And you might be wondering, there's actually what we call throttling in for completion actions. So obviously, let's say in that particular Pardot form, that customer actually, or the prospect actually submits the form twice. Will they actually receive, based on the actions here, will they actually receive 2 autoresponder emails? And that is where one thing you should know with completion actions is that certain actions have throttling to them. So in this case, when you're sending an autoresponder email and Pardot identifies that this is the same prospect that uh, submits that form, what would happen is actually there's, I think, a 1 hour time limit before they can actually complete that, be qualified to for the actions again. So if the action is sending an autoresponder email, it will be there will be needed a 1 hour time period needed in between in order for them to, for the action to be done again. So that's just one thing you need to take into account when you're um, using completion actions. So completion actions, once again, this actually triggers off of any marketing cloud or any part of asset. So form handlers, that as well, landing pages, as well as email, you can actually use them. Sorry, not email. So landing pages, you can actually do this as well, and that would actually be attached on the completion actions on whatever form or form handlers you attach to this landing form. But you can actually use that in landing form as well. So most marketing cloud Pardot assets will be actually able to actually do completion actions. All right, let's move on to the next Pardot automation tool. So in this scenario, the marketing has also recently launched a series of web-based articles on the company website. And you'd like any prospect that has viewed any of these articles to be added to the prospect list. So in this scenario, where they're not, the prospect is not actually submitting anything on the website, or they're not actually completing any forms. They're just simply viewing the page that contains the web, your art or your company's articles. And what they would require is that any prospect that views this particular page would actually have to be added to a prospect list. Or let's say, let's have an additional one. Let's say, uh, maybe you have a product interest field for your prospect, and you can actually add that particular web series or web article series as their product interest. So what you can actually make use of this time is page actions. So the difference between page actions and completion actions is, page actions, actually, the trigger is the viewing of the page itself. With completion actions, it has to be a sort of a trigger, such as a file download, or the form submission. Basically, a prospect action has to occur aside from viewing simply the page. So the page action, we'd actually need to add so the way you can actually meet this requirement is actually to use page actions to add prospects into a list, and you can associate them with a campaign when they view articles, Salesforce campaign when they view the articles. So let's take a look at what page actions is all about. Page actions, they're also classified actually as completion actions, but they are triggered by a prospect's page views. And the same things, it only works on prospects, not visitors. It only works on any page. It works on any page that contains the Pardot tracking code. And it's also not retroactive, doesn't apply to anybody who's viewed the page before the page actions were set up. So if we take a look at how we set that up, we go to automations, and there will be what we call here page actions. And as you can see, so setting up a web article series, you put in the page URL or the URL where you want that page action to occur, and the different actions that can be actually done here. You'll see it here. So basically, adding tags to the prospect, similarly to to page actions. You can also create Salesforce tasks, notify the user. The difference here between the completion actions is we're not actually sending an email. You can't actually use page actions to actually send an email to that particular prospect. And then the different assigning prospect via Salesforce active assignment rule, assigning to the user, and that's basically it. If the prospect actually views that, once you've set the page action, once you set it up, if that prospect actually views that particular page, it will actually trigger the corresponding page actions that you have set. So just to reiterate the difference between page action and completion actions, page actions trigger on the viewing of the page itself. And with completion actions, they have to complete a prospect action such as submitting a form or downloading a file. And yeah, that's it. So the next automation tool that you make use of, so let's say the sales team this time has set up a request a demo form on your website. And what they want is that any prospect that submits the form and has a prospect grade of B plus or higher from Australia has to be added to a prospect list. It also needs to create a task in Salesforce and also be assigned to the Australia queue. So this time you're actually taking a look at a number of things here. So you're actually for this action, you're actually listening for a specific prospect action, which is when the prospect submits the form. But you also have a criteria based um, uh, uh, factor here, which is the prospect grade and the country of that particular prospect. So this is a combination of a prospect action plus a specific criteria about that prospect. So in this case, if we're going to do that, you're going to rely on automation rules to actually set up with the required criteria and the required prospect action. And you'll be able to achieve that with the automation rule. So the automation rule, so I forgot to change this one. Sorry about that. So with automation rules, this is actually a criteria-based rule as well that would run so long as it's active, and would actually keep attempting to qualify which prospects meet that particular criteria. Out of all the automation rules, this is actually the most broad and the most flexible. I'll show you this later on. It has the most uh, criteria they can actually consider when you're actually setting up this automation rule. It can listen for almost all of the things that the different automation tools can do. And when it comes to the actions that the automation rules can actually do, it's actually also the most flexible and the most broad. It can actually do almost everything that the different automation tools can do. And uh, this one actually also runs retroactively and constantly. It actually takes, so even if the prospect comes in, it actually takes a look at all of the particular, the past. If let's say one of your criteria is it downloaded this particular form in the past, or downloaded this particular form, whether or not they downloaded in the future or in the past, so long as they meet the criteria that they downloaded in that form, they can actually uh, be qualified for that particular automation rule. So they run retroactively and also constantly. So long as this particular rule is active, it's going to keep running and keep trying to qualify any prospects for that particular automation rule. And the third thing is, um, there's now the ability to actually repeat rules. Now, originally, the automation rules can only apply the actions once. So let's say you have an automation rule that adds prospects into a list, or adds a specific score to the prospect score. Let's say adds +5 to the prospect score. Originally, what that would do is if you qualified for this already once, you won't be, even if you qualify in the next few while this automation rule is running, you won't keep getting +5 in your Pardot score or your prospect score. So there's now an option to actually be able to repeat rules. So meaning you can actually identify when this rule will be able to reapply these actions. And this is actually a feature that was already introduced in Pardot. So we'll be taking a look at that later. So let's go back to this scenario. So to set up automation rules, just go to automation rules here, obviously. And then let's try creating that automation rule that person that sales team is actually requesting. So this case, let's just put test here for now. Test automation rule. Save that, categorized. So what I was saying is the repeat rule. So this is actually an example. This is actually what I was saying. It's an eligibility to actually be able to match prospect more than once and apply the actions more than once. And you have the option to limit the rule matches to more than a few numbers, or just to allow it unlimitedly. So the days before eligible repeat rule is, the certain time period before they can qualify that prospect for that automation rule again. So if you're already qualified for the automation rule, let's say uh, uh, today, and then tomorrow, obviously nothing changed with your criteria and you're still qualified. Um, only after a day will you be able to actually be apply that +5 on the Pardot score or whatever action you have in this automation rule. So in rules, as you can see, uh, it has the most broad, a lot of things here that you can take into account. So prospect form handler, so we're saying prospect actions, such as downloading or uh, submitting forms. You can actually have that with automation rule if they're going to, in this case, let's say the requirement was the requested demo. So in this case, this was a requested demo form. So if that particular prospect submits the form successfully, what was the other thing? It actually needs to have a prospect grade. So let's add another rule. So the prospect grade is greater than B, and if that country has to be. So we're taking a look at the criteria as well as the prospect action. So prospect default field. Take a look at the country. Contains or has to be Australia. You can change that to equal. Doesn't matter. And then what was the last criteria? So that's basically it. So you're listening for specific prospect action, and you're listening for some prospect specific characteristics as part of your criteria. So an automation rule is capable of doing that. The certain automation tools, the dynamic list, the segmentation list, that will not be able. Segmentation rule will not be capable of doing that. So when it comes to action, it's also, as I mentioned, the most flexible. It has almost all the actions, sending out emails, sending prospect emails, uh, assigning prospect to queue. The only probably difference here that I can remember is the autoresponder, because you're not actually responding this. You're not autoresponder emails, which is in the completion action. Once you complete the action, they send out an email. So they want actually to create a task. So one of the actions we set create a Salesforce task, prospect completed form call. Say let's assign this to whichever the CRM owner for this particular prospect, and not started. Yes, and then assign another action. So they need to be added to a list. So you need to add prospect to a list. So let's say we add them to let's say for this one, just add them to the internal newsletter, and then must be assigned to the queue. So you can with automation tools, you can assign them to the user in a group. You assign prospect to a queue. You can assign them to a specific user. You can also, if you have existing workflows in your CRM and you're assigning leads and contacts based on an assignment rule, you can actually just make use of the assignment rule. So any active assignment rule that you may have will actually be referenced here in the Pardot criteria, and you can actually just make use of that. Or you can just, as the requirement says, assign the prospect to a queue. So in the sandbox that I'm using, there's no queue setup, but that's basically how you're going to set this up. And then there's an option here to actually execute this in real time. You normally would actually just want to run automation rules in real time if you're actually if you're actually making use of time sensitive data. But if you're not actually using time sensitive data that could change would change in a matter of seconds, then you might as well not just leave execute in real time. So once you have that, you just set up automation, click create automation rules, and then it's going to start at pause. And once you hit active, it's going to begin trying to qualify prospects in for this particular automation rule. So going back here to the automation rules, here are just some of the things that that you need to consider that's not listed here. So one thing that I haven't listed here is actually, so you might be thinking, if an automation rule can also add and remove prospects from our list, then why would we ever need to actually use a dynamic list? Why can't we just set up an automation rule that adds this prospect to this list and remove prospects from this list, and then just not never use a dynamic list? Well, the difference is, one is a dynamic list will constantly actually add and remove prospects on their own if they no longer meet the criteria. So let's say you meet the criteria today. If tomorrow you no longer meet the criteria, you'll be removed from that dynamic list. But in the case of an automation rule, let's say you have an automation rule that adds prospect to this list based on if their Pardot grade is A plus. Let's say if your grade is A plus and the automation rule qualifies you, it's going to add you into that list. But if you no longer, let's say your Pardot grade suddenly becomes B, the the automation rules action is only to add you to that particular list. It will not unmatch you from that list, or will not remove you from that list. If you're no longer matched for an automation rule, it's not going to do the opposite action. It's just going to not do the action. So if your action is to add that list and you meet the criteria, you're going to get added to the list. But once you no longer satisfy that criteria, you're not going to be removed from that list unless you have another automation rule that removes you from that list. So the problem here is that if you want to, manage you want to have a self-managing prospect list and you use automation rules, each time you want that list to be automatically populated, you're going to set up two sets of rules. One that adds that prospect into the list and another rule that removes that prospect from the list. So now instead of just using that, all you need to do is just set up a dynamic list. Now, with that in mind, you can see how these two automation tools will be used. How do I know which one to use in which specific scenarios or which specific things to use? So all you need to do is follow this simple thought process. Well, first thing you need to ask yourself, what is the rule based on? You can use, is it based on the prospect action, or form submissions, file downloads, or page views, or is it based on on the of uh, criteria of the prospect. So a field about the prospect, let's say, the job title or the prospect score or the Pardot score, the Pardot grade of that particular prospect. If you're based on the prospect action, then you will be using the completion action or the page actions, since these automations will happen once that particular prospect has completed the action. So if you're looking to initiate this particular rule based on the action and not time-based or like constantly running in the background, um, then you're going to use completion actions. If you're more looking to actually initiate your automation based on a criteria about, let's say, the prospect, let's say it's about the prospect grade. Whenever the prospect score reaches 100 and above, you're not going to use completion actions. Instead, you're going to ask yourself this time, is my criteria-based rule going to run one time only? So if it's a criteria-based rule and it's going to run one time only, you're going to use segmentation rules. So segmentation rules make use of the different criteria about the prospect, and it only runs one time. So if that's where you are in the thought process, you just choose segmentation rule. If it's a criteria-based process and it doesn't run one time only, and then the next thing you should ask yourself, what do I actually want to happen with that automation? So if your main goal is to just have an updated list that's based on the criteria, then you use a dynamic list, as I mentioned. So the dynamic list just constantly checks any prospect that matches the criteria that you define in that dynamic list, prospect grade, prospect score, let's say, the tags of that prospect. Uh, if that gets updated, it get add. If they qualify, they get added to the dynamic list. If they no longer qualify, they get removed from the dynamic list. So if your desired outcome is for an updated list, you go for dynamic list. If your desired outcome for your automation, on the other hand, is to perform a certain action or another action of the criteria, such as creating Salesforce tasks, sending an email, um, updating a field for that particular prospect, or assigning that prospect in CRM or adding them to a campaign, or basically another action aside from updating the list, then you use automation rules. So the automation rule is kind of your final catch-all. So you can use automation rule for most of the things that you want to happen in Pardot. So this is kind of just the thought process of which one to use. Now, okay, I understand where I can use it, or no, I understand what are the different automation tools that is available for me, and what are the different ways or scenarios that which one I should use in that scenario. So this time it's more of a general, where can I use it? So you can automate things, but what can it necessarily do in Pardot? So the very first thing obviously is for list management. So lists are most likely going to be used a lot in Pardot. If you're using Pardot, they're most definitely going to be using lists. It's where you send out emails to, and it's where you actually use as the recipient for your engagement programs. So if you don't want to actually micromanage your lists, you have to use automation tools. It can be the dynamic list, the automation rules, or basically all the automation tools if you want for list management. So certain actions that you can do with automation tools, adding prospect to a list, removing that prospect from a list. And then for another thing that you can actually use automation tools for is prospect management. So prospect management, you can add, remove tags, you can update the values in the default or the custom fields. So basically any prospect information. Let's take more specific actions here on the automations that you can do that is related to prospect management. Let's say actions. So if it's related to prospect management, you can assign the prospect to somebody. You can change the profile criteria, the custom default, or update as I was saying, custom field value, default value of that particular customer as well. And for email sends, you can actually send out prospect emails as well. So you can actually send emails using automation rules. Maybe let's say it's a reminder, if it's a notification that you might want, a scheduled notification that you may have. CRM workflow, so some CRM related tasks here, assigning them to queue, to a user, or via an assignment rule. You can add them to a CRM campaign. You can create them with a Salesforce task. You can even have the option to not sync this particular record with CRM. And then scoring and grading management, you can increase or decrease the score of that person, or adjust the prospect score of that person, adjust the prospect score, uh, and you can change the prospect profile or the grading profile that you actually apply to this particular person. And these are the things you can actually do with the automation tools in Pardot. So it's up to your creativity on what particular thing what particular requirement you may have in order to, and you can use these different automation tools to accomplish that particular Pardot requirement that you may have. And that's basically it when we're talking about automation tools. The only thing we have left is actually engagement programs, and we'll be having that in the next session. So once again, that next session is all about engagement programs. It's an interesting topic as well that will be on session 4. This is actually the QR code for it. I'm not sure if Karen is actually also in this call, also in this webinar. Maybe she can explain that to us again. But in the meantime, I'll actually take a look at some of the questions that you may have. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to ask them in the webinar chat. And Karen, if you're on this call, feel free to explain this QR code. Again, I don't know how we actually use them. You obviously have to scan them with something, but I'm not entirely familiar what you should scan them with. So Paul is here is actually you have to use the iPhone camera. So this, I'm not sure if this is just Apple exclusive, but you use the iPhone camera to actually get the webinar's next session. So you just point the camera, the iPhone's camera here, and I think apparently that's going to, register you for the next event. So we have a couple minutes. If you don't have any questions, I'd like to thank you for joining us in today's session. I know it's a bit on the technical side, but hopefully, you'd be able to use these different automation tools to accomplish the different tasks that you may have in Pardot. So, list management, prospect management, email sends, CRM workflow, or scoring or grading management. All of this can help you out with, automation tools can help you out with all of this. So if there are no more questions, I believe, then I think that's it. Thanks for joining us in today's session. And hopefully you integrate your Salesforce with your Pardot. And if you're interested in Pardot or Salesforce in general, you can reach out AF Digital as well for these kinds of things. So thanks for joining us, and all of you have a pleasant day.